Okay. Well, open your Bibles to 1 Kings, please. And when you picked up an outline, you notice this one has two sides on it. This books of 1st, 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles are, to me, it's some of my favorite reading in the Old Testament. But what we're following here is the development of the monarchy, the development of the kingdom, the splitting of the kingdom of Israel. And so what I've done is put on the back. Of course, you've got three kings under the United Kingdom: Saul, David, and Solomon, each reigning for about 40 years. And then after Solomon, the kingdom splits. And so you have on the back, on the left-hand side, is the kings of Israel, which are the 10 northern tribes, and all of their kings. And then on the right-hand side, you have the kingdom of Judah, which are the 2 southern tribes of the 12 tribes of Israel. And it begins with Solomon's son's Rehoboam. And so all of this history begins here in the book of 1 Kings. And I didn't put this in there, but so those 19 kings of Israel, not one of them Scripture refers to as good. They're all evil. But on the right-hand side of Judah, you've got Numbers 3 and 4, 8 through 11, 13 and 16 were all good kings. So you've got like 8 good kings, if you want to note that. Numbers 3 and 4, 8, 9, 10, 11, 13 and 16 were all good kings. And so that's just a bit of extra information that I put in there that's good to know.
That 100 years of mixed leadership, I didn't add them up or anything, but how many years of good leadership was there out of that?
Well, I mean, 66, 100, over 200, approximately. Now, and that's one of the hard things about reading Kings and Chronicles. The books of Kings cover both Israel and Judah. And so one of the things that kind of makes it confusing, for instance, is like number 9 in Israel and number 5 in Judah. They've got the same name. That happens like 3 times where they've got the same, and some of them are reigning at the same time. And so if you don't, it can just be a little bit confusing as you're reading through the text. Seemed like there was another one. Yeah, okay, so number 12 under Israel and number 8 under Judah, Jehoash and Joash. Well, same exact names, 2 different kings for the 2 different nations. And then you've got some guys like number 5 under Israel reigned for 7 days and committed suicide. And then you've got somebody like Manasseh over here under Judah, number 14, reigned for 55 years. So it's just good it helps me to be able to see that. And I've noted it in the margins of my Bible. Who's who, and are they in Israel or Judah? And of course, most of the time it'll say, so-and-so became king of Israel, and he was whatever, and then he reigned for this long. Anyway, all right, so here we are. Key thoughts. Well, obviously, through the first 11 chapters, you've got the United Kingdom of Israel under Solomon. This is the golden age of Israel. Unsurpassed wealth and power. Solomon's days, unless you consider towards the end of his reign, Israel is the dominant empire, and they don't have any real challenges. They've got treaties all around, and that's to their financial benefit, certainly not to their spiritual benefit, but rather peaceful during Solomon's time. So then after chapter 11, you have the division of the kingdom into northern Israel, which is referred to sometimes as Israel, sometimes it's referred to as Samaria. That's just good information to know. And southern Israel, which is referred to as Judah. Key characters. Well, obviously, Solomon, first 11 chapters. The kings of Israel and Judah. But then there are a couple of them that just really stand out. And I guess frankly I could list them all, but here's just a few that I picked. Jeroboam. So the first king of Israel, first king of the northern 10 tribes, reigned for 22 years, and, well, let's just look at it. Turn over to 1 Kings chapter 12 real quick. So after Solomon's death, one of his servants by the name of Jeroboam and his son by the name of Rehoboam split the kingdom. And actually it's part of its fulfillment of prophecy that the kingdom would be taken away from Solomon and given to someone else, someone specifically who would have 10 tribes, and that turns out to be Jeroboam. Well, so there's now, instead of this united kingdom of all 12 tribes, now there's some competition between the 10 northern and the 2 southern tribes, and Jeroboam's trying to figure out, essentially, how can I maintain control over what I've got? So, 1 Kings 12, beginning in verse 25, it gives the account of something that Jeroboam does to try to retain power. Jeroboam built Shechem in Mount Ephraim and dwelt therein, and went out from thence and built Peniel. And Jeroboam said in his heart, now shall the kingdom return to the house of David. And that's the way it's pictured sometimes, that there's war between the house of David and the house of Saul. And, he doesn't want his part to go to southern Israel, to Judah. If the people go up to do sacrifice in the house of the Lord at Jerusalem, then shall the heart of this people turn again unto their Lord, even unto Rehoboam, king of Judah. And they'll kill me, and go again to Rehoboam, king of Judah. Wherefore the king took counsel, and made 2 calves of gold, and said unto them, it is too much for you to go up to Jerusalem. So that's rather political. I want to make things easy for you guys. That's just too much to ask for you to go all the way to Jerusalem. It's kind of Absalomish. Remember, Absalom was, oh man, if everybody brought their case to me, I'd do them justice. Everybody'd love me. Anyway, he makes these 2 golden images because it's just too hard to go to Jerusalem. Behold thy gods, O Israel, which brought thee up out of the land of Egypt. And he set the one in Bethel, and the other put he in Dan. So one in the north, one in the south. And this thing became a sin for the people went to worship before the one, even unto Dan. So I'm going to make things easier, but that's not his motive. His motive is to retain power. And that's his great kindness, supposedly, is nothing but a political move. He made a house of high priests, verse 31, and made priests of the lowest people of the people, which were not of the sons of Levi. He ordained a feast in the 8th month on the 15th day. Well, the feast time, this particular feast was supposed to be on the 7th month of the 14th day. So, it's just a month and a day. That's not much. And he changed that. Changed the place of worship, the time of worship, changed the objects of worship, all in an effort to retain power. So, that to me, that's one of the key characters, because now for the rest of the history of Israel, when a king is bad, he's always either compared to Jeroboam or is likened unto Jeroboam. Throughout the rest of the book, it talks about the sin that Jeroboam caused Israel to sin. And this is it. Elijah is a key character in the book of 1 Kings. And of course, during the days of Elijah, you have Ahab and Jezebel. And there's not quite anybody like Ahab and Jezebel. In fact, the text tells us that, I'm trying to find it here. I had to send my Bible off to a bindery that has all my notes in it and the markings that I use every day, and I'm a little discombobulated. But anyway, the book of 1 Kings tells you that there was no one like Ahab who sold himself to do evil more than he did. So Ahab and Jezebel are quite the characters throughout the book of 1 Kings. Any questions or comments on all of that stuff? Kind of introductory. Okay, so I've got 10 key events here in the book. Number 1 is God's 2 appearances to Solomon. Now, we're not going to read all of these texts, but, Typically, when we think of Solomon, what's the first thing that comes to our mind? The temple? Yeah. That's first 4 or 5 chapters. What else? It's wisdom. His judgment. There's nothing else that comes to your mind about Solomon. His women. Okay. That's what I was getting at ultimately because of my first point here. God appears to Solomon twice and tells him, if you do this and this, if you follow me like your father David did, then there will not fail to be a man of your lineage who will sit on the throne, and the kingdom will continue. And of course, 1 Kings chapter 3 records his prayer after, David's gone, Solomon becomes king, and he prays, as we know, for, 1 Kings 3, verse 9. Give therefore thy servant an understanding heart to judge thy people, that I may discern between good and bad. For who is able to judge this thy so great a people? And that's a humble prayer. And so God, beginning in verse 10, the speech pleased the Lord. And so beginning in verse 11, you have God's first appearance to Solomon. And then you get to, after the temple's built and after the dedication of the temple, you get to 1 Kings chapter 9, and you have God's second appearance to Solomon, and says the exact same thing. If you follow me and do this and that, 1 Kings 9:4. If thou wilt walk before me as David thy father walked, in integrity of heart and in uprightness, to do according to all that I have commanded thee, and wilt keep my statutes and my judgments, then I will establish the throne of thy kingdom. But that's all against the backdrop then of, we're studying Ecclesiastes on Sunday nights. We know what that's all about. And then you get to 1 Kings chapter 11, and the first word in 1 Kings chapter 11 is but. And so in his early years, you have all of these successes and these two appearances of God to him, telling him, here's what you do and here's what will happen if you do it. And then he just goes off the rails. Were you going to ask a question?
Seeing how Solomon liked women so much, wasn't that kind of like Baal worship? Because the act of sex, getting rid of his sin through the woman, and when she has her time, she purges the sin?
I don't know about that. I think it's reading a little too much into it. But when you get to 1 Kings chapter 11, obviously, that thing became a sin unto him, and he built them houses, and he built their high places. He turned wholly to idolatry because of them. But you have, early on in the book, those two appearances, and God is very clear of, if this is what you want to have happen, here's what you do. And it's just hard to grasp sometimes for me personally how God blessed him with wisdom above everybody. And yet he went this way. Well, then you've got the building of the temple in chapters 5 and 6. And, of course, we understand David really wanted I guess you'd say initiated that process. And you go back to 2 Samuel chapter 7 where David and Nathan are communicating about this. And then God communicates to Nathan to tell David, no. But one of the things that God says there is, have I ever commanded anybody to build me a house? Well, no, he hadn't. But this was something David wanted to do. David was forbidden from doing it. But you might say he set the stage for Solomon to be able to do that. So chapters 5 and 6 record all of that. If you look at chapter 6 and verse 37, it took him 4 years to lay the foundation of the house of the Lord. And in the 11th year, in the month Bul, which is the 8th month, was the house finished, throughout all the parts thereof, and according to all the fashion of it. So he was 7 years in building it. 4 years for the foundation, 7 years for the remainder of the structure. And, of course, then chapter 7 details more specifically the structure itself. And then number 3 here, Solomon's speech and prayer of dedication to the temple. That's quite, chapter 8 is a rather long chapter, 66 verses, but I would call it a prayer of dedication. He's doing it in front of everybody, but it's really a prayer, is quite the prayer. And again, his humility, to me, his humility shines through to some extent. For instance, look at 1 Kings chapter 8, verse 26. And now, O God of Israel, let thy word, I pray thee, be verified, which thou spokest unto thy servant David my father. But will God indeed dwell on the earth? Behold, the heaven of heavens cannot contain thee, how much less this house that I have built. So, again, I can see throughout those early chapters the humility of Solomon before God. And particularly in this prayer, he asks for, like beginning in verse 31, if any man trespass, and then they do this, and then they turn, hear from heaven and forgive. And that concept is repeated in several different scenarios throughout the rest of the chapter. But it's always if they do this and then turn unto thee, hear from heaven and forgive their sins. And he recognizes also, look at 1 Kings 8 and verse 56. Blessed be the Lord that hath given rest unto his people Israel according to all that he promised. There hath not failed one word of all of his good promise. So he recognizes the faithfulness of God throughout all of this, and even down to back to the promises that he gave to Moses. God's fulfilled everything. He's kept his word. So chapter 8 is quite a prayer of dedication. You get to chapter 10, the Queen of Sheba visits Solomon, and it's interesting the rabbit trails people go down with this one, and the implications people take with the relationship between Sheba and Solomon, and there's nothing in the text that would indicate any of that they had a child together and that they had some type of physical relationship. There's nothing in the biblical text that would indicate that. She comes there to hear his wisdom and to see, is everything what I've heard, is it that? And so when she heard everything Solomon had to say and saw the kingdom, what was her response? Anybody remember? The half was not even told to me. So she was greatly impressed, and the kingdoms have I guess you would say, a treaty. And then you get to chapter 11. Well, I tell you what, before we do that, look at 1 Kings chapter 10, and somebody read verse 21 for us, please. And this is just indicative of the financial context, I guess.
And all King Solomon's drinking vessels were of gold, and all the vessels of the house of the forest of Lebanon were of pure gold. None were of silver. It was nothing accounted up in the days of Solomon.
There's so much gold that's, like there's this, I love the Three Stooges. There's this episode where they have a dry cleaning business. And they do, it's painted on the front window. They'll tailor and something else, and then it says altercations. Anyway, they find this suit that's got money in a pocket, and it's got a bunch of hundreds, and he's counting through it. 100, 100, 100. 50, how'd that get in there? He throws it off to the side. Well, that's how silver was. There's so much gold. There's so much wealth that, silver's like nothing. It's like rocks, in fact. One version says. And all of this, and I think Solomon, as we read through these early chapters, recognizes the source of all of this. It's God and God's faithfulness. And then you get to chapter 11, and again, that first word is but. There it is, 1 Kings 10:27. The king made silver to be in Jerusalem as stones. That's how common it was, and probably how little value it had because of the amount of gold. Somebody on the live stream asks, didn't God lay out a set of rules, guidelines, and prohibitions for the kings of Israel? to include riches as well as having multiple wives. Yes, and that's Deuteronomy 17, verses 14 through 20. And it's not just riches and multiple wives, it's also horses. If you get too many horses, you're going to want to go back to Egypt where they come from. Well, Solomon had, was it 20,000 stables for his horses or something? I forget what the text says, but thousands of stables for his horses. And those have actually been uncovered by archaeologists, found his so that, again, that's the interesting thing. Solomon being blessed with wisdom, these two appearances of God to Solomon, and the law, yes, very specifically in Deuteronomy 17, forbade kings from doing certain things, and he did every one of them. And again, all of that's going on in the background of that prayer of dedication and his at least his verbalizing the faithfulness of God and all of that. And then, of course, you get to chapter 11. And, and that's another thing. So chapter 11, the events that are recorded here with his many foreign women, that didn't happen overnight. That didn't happen on one day after all the good stuff happened. That's ongoing. One of his wives was an Egyptian, and he married her for political treaty. And that's what kings often did to hopefully have some peace between two empires. But he takes it to a whole nother level. Not only the daughter of Pharaoh, but the Moabites, the Ammonites, Edomites, Zidonians, Hittites, the very people. When you go back to Deuteronomy chapter 7, God says, you don't make any treaties with these people, and you don't marry them. Because why? Why did he tell them not to intermarry? They will turn your heart away from me, and you'll start serving their gods. Well, 1 Kings 11:3. And his wives turned away his heart. He went after, verse 5, the Ashtaroth, the goddess of the Zidonians, and Milcom, the abomination of the Ammonites. And Solomon did evil in the sight of the Lord and went not fully after the Lord, as did David his father. So these first 11 chapters, we need to move on. I've spent more time there than I had intended, but there's so much there. And it's just amazing to see that. It's almost like a split personality with Solomon or something. I don't know. All right, so Solomon dies, chapter 11, verse 43. And now the kingdom splits between his servant Jeroboam and his son Rehoboam, northern Israel, southern Israel. And Rehoboam wants some advice. And I would say we're probably familiar with this. Solomon, all the way back to Samuel in 1 Samuel chapter 8, that's when the people said, make us a king to judge us like all the nations. And Samuel was rather disturbed by that and spoke with God. And God said, Samuel, they've not rejected you. They've rejected me. Give them a king. But you tell them what it's going to be like. Tell them how he's going to use them and turn them into basically a state forced labor movement. And that's exactly what happens throughout time. And so now Rehoboam comes to the throne, and rightfully so, because he's the heir. And he wants, okay, so how do we handle this situation? Well, the people from Solomon's days are like, listen, you got to lighten the load here. Be a servant to the people. And so he takes that advice, and then he takes the advice of the people he grew up with. And, what was their advice? Yeah. I don't know that tougher is even the right word. You look down at beginning 1 Kings 12, verse 10. He goes to the young people and tell them, my little finger is going to be thicker than my father's waist. And that's a threat. You thought it was tough then? Well, he chastised you with whips. I'm coming after you with scorpions. And so, Jeroboam and all the people, they're waiting to hear how Rehoboam's going to behave, and he tells them that, and they're like, all right, we're gone. We have no part in David. And the kingdom splits. And you have the northern Israel, Samaria, and the southern Judah. And so and I told you this, but what 1 and 2 Kings then does is it follows both kingdoms simultaneously. And there's some overlapping, and there's some same and some similar names. But then you get to the book of Chronicles, and Chronicles follows only the tribe of Judah, and in some more detail than Kings does, so it's good to know that too. Jeroboam's golden calves, we've already talked about that. Number 9, beginning in 1 Kings chapter 17, we run into this guy by the name of Elijah. And he is quite a character. And, when I use the term character, I'm not implying that this is like a fairy tale or something, but, we say that about people today. Man, he's a character. Well, Elijah he's one of what we call the unwritten prophets. Elijah doesn't have a book. And then who followed Elijah in prophet? Elisha. They don't have their written books like Isaiah does, but their events are recorded here, and then, of course, they're mentioned in other places in Scripture. But from 1 Kings 17 to 2 Kings chapter 2, we follow the life, the teachings, and the miracles of Elijah. And typically, when we think of miracles, we think of Jesus and the apostles and all of that stuff. But, man, there are a bunch of miracles that Elijah and Elisha perform. And so that's good to know and to be familiar with that kind of stuff. And primarily, Elijah deals with Ahab and Jezebel. And Ahab, just looking back here, Ahab is your 7th king of Israel. He reigns for 22 years and not a good individual at all. But just for instance, one of the occasions when Elijah comes to Ahab, and like I said, this is not the right Bible that I'm used to having, but he comes to Ahab, and Ahab says, "Is that you, O troubler of Israel?" And Elijah says, "Listen, I'm not the one who's troubled Israel. You have." But, that's interesting. I've found that to be the case through personal experience as a preacher. There are times when you stand for what's right, and people will come to me and say, "Why'd you do that?" Or question a sermon that I preached because, I didn't handle it right, or something like that. And it's sometimes when you stand for the truth, you're the troublemaker. The roles are flipped, and if you just leave us alone, everything would be okay. And that's how Ahab addressed Elijah. "Is that you, O troubler of Israel?" But I don't have that marked in this Bible, so I can't show you where it is. Here it is. 1 Kings 18, verse 17. "And it came to pass, when Ahab saw Elijah, that Ahab said unto him, Art thou he that troubleth Israel? And he answered, I have not troubled Israel, but thou and thy father's house, and that ye have forsaken the commandments of the Lord, and thou hast followed Balaam." And of course, that's the context of the prophets of Baal. And, a lot of times we talk about the 450 prophets of Baal that Elijah defeated on Mount Carmel. There's actually 850 prophets and Elijah. And, of course, you read 1 Kings chapter 18 and we see what happens there. And those 850 prophets are put to death. Well, Ahab and Jezebel, that kind of says enough, doesn't it? If you are familiar with them. But that starts in 1 Kings 16 and then goes through the end of chapter 21. Any questions or comments on all of this stuff? There is kind of one interesting thing. Look at 1 Kings chapter 19 that I want to point out. So these are bad times, particularly for northern Israel. You're talking approximately, 250 to 230 years, 19 kings, and not one good one. And so, but then you've got men like Elijah and Elisha, and kind of peppered throughout 1 and 2 Kings, you'll read about a man of God or a prophet, and they'll never be named. It's just that. Well, you look at 1 Kings 19:18. This is when Elijah Jezebel's threatened his life, and he's gone to a cave to be depressed, essentially. And God says, I have left 7,000 in Israel, all the knees which have not bowed unto Baal, and every mouth which hath not kissed him. So Elijah's not alone, and that just shows that there is, we read throughout the Old Testament of this remnant concept. So there's 7,000 people who are faithful to God, even though you've got people like Ahab and Jezebel in power. It's kind of like Proverbs says, when the ungodly, or is it the unrighteous reign, the people mourn. Well, I would say you probably had 7,000 folks there that were in mourning while Ahab and Jezebel were in charge. Any questions or comments? Okay. There's just so much. There's so much in this book that could be discussed. But we won't. So one thing, let me go ahead and say this. We were supposed to start Psalms on, last Wednesday night, but we didn't. We're not going to do Psalms in this class on Sunday morning because I don't know how you overview 150 chapters. I don't know how to do that. So we're going to skip over Psalms in here, but we're going to study it on Wednesday nights. So just give you a heads up on that. All right, guys, thanks.